Welcome everyone to Beets, Beds, and Browns. My name's Joe Skibby. We're here with PitMoss founder Mont Handley, CEO Brian Scott, and soil scientist Dr. Charles Bethke. Guys, I want to thank you all for taking the time and joining me this afternoon. What I want to do is I want to share a little bit of the history of PitMoss and talk about its relevance to the industry and contribution to the circular economy, as well as talk about ways that we can incorporate it into our growing strategy, both early on in spring, throughout the season, and late into summer and fall. So with that, I will go to Mont and have you talk a little bit about experience in founding PitMoss and participating in Shark Tank and leading us up to the point where we're at now.
So it starts with my first job out of college, which was 100 years ago. But I used to work at a fairly upscale nursery in the Chicago market. And one of the days I was there, we had a couple deliveries of sphagnum peat moss from Canada. And I had just read an article in Sierra Magazine about how harvesting sphagnum peat moss from wetlands was destructive to the wetlands. And I thought someone should come up with an alternative. And I thought, well, maybe I could do that. And so I started experimenting soon after that thought. And I was using recycled paper. At the time, in the mid 90s, everyone was talking about recycling. It was sort of a new industry. And so I started experimenting with a Cuisinart that my mom gave me when I moved into my first apartment. I mean, I don't make pesto, so it was probably the right thing to experiment with. And I think it still sits in the boardroom there at PitMoss. So after about 3 years of experimenting and trying to teach myself organic chemistry and soil science, I think I came up with what I thought was a stable formula. But most importantly, we kind of engineered a new, I want to say it kind of engineered a soil, if you will, out of paper, out of cellulose. And the way I like to think of it is you look at it under a microscope and it looks like almost like a yarn ball. It looks like, you're wrapping it up and pulling it apart and twisting it and basically trying to get as much air pocket into that as possible. I don't know if that's correct, Dr. Bethke. Did I do something right, or?
You did everything right. From a standpoint of structure and the way you did it, it's remarkable that you had the intuition on how to go about that.
Well, I have to give that intuition to my grandmother, who, when I was really young, my grandmother watched us. And she always had a vegetable garden, always was growing fruits and vegetables to help supplement the budget of the family. And she always made me put newspaper down around the plants. And that was to keep, I guess, the weeds and stuff down. But I just always had those thoughts, like you could use paper as a gardening product. So that's where the original idea came from.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I love the archive piece of having the Cuisinart still in the boardroom. You always got to look at where you've come. And you mentioned recipe. I hear cellulose, I hear paper, and a Cuisinart. And I think maybe you're just throwing some news clippings out there. Obviously, there's much more to it if you're indicating that there's a recipe. Can you touch on that?
Like almost any consumable product, we do have recipes related to the base formula that Mont developed, right? So over the years, and it's taken us 5 or 6 years now, working with Dr. Bethke, with a lot of customers, doing iterations of the product. And we have just learned what materials work well with that raw cellulose fiber to turn into good growing materials. And you can see some packages behind my back. Each one of those products has a different, unique formula to it. And we don't share what is in those formulas. We don't, because we think what we're doing is pretty unique. And we've learned every day about how much different it is to grow in cellulose fiber than a topsoil or peat or cocoa coir. And we really kind of optimize our formulations to work with that. So I think, like, from a generic perspective, we can talk about that without deep diving into what sorts of ingredients.
As it's treated, are there any materials from inks to glues that you need to be concerned with as you're taking and creating this new substrate?
I think I could speak to that in that now the Environmental Protection Association and all of the rules for recycled materials require that inks be made without the use of any heavy metals. Primarily soy inks are done. Also, Mont Handley had the good sense to do his initial research work with the USDA grant on studying the papers from various sources. And I don't remember, was it 19 different sources or something like that, Mont, that you studied at that time?
And I think it was 30, if I could be.
30.
Yeah. And it was with the EPA, Dr. Bethke.
Okay, was with the EPA. All right, I'm really an expert. I know exactly what you did, but no, with the EPA, and we learned that there no problem with the heavy metals, and there with recycled materials, the biggest problem we have is trash mixed into the trash, pieces of metal or something that someone throws in that we have to sort out, and of course, when we produce everything, it's inspected by hand, by people, all the way through from beginning to end. But in terms of pollutants or toxic materials, we take great efforts on any new sources of cellulose to make sure that there's no contamination that would be damaging in any way. So we're very pleased with that. And, I think people can use it with confidence.
Yeah, I would add, Joe, too, like when Mont first developed the product, it was mainly focused on using newsprint, and that was a lot of the research, and a lot of the results of that grant that he mentioned were a result of that. And the really interesting thing is that 34% of what goes to the landfill today is after recycling is still cellulose fiber material. So we have been spending the last 4 or 5, well, more than that, 5 or 6 years looking at different cellulose inputs that we could use. And we have now evolved that from just using like a newsprint to now being able to use like office paper, magazines, cardboard, press board. So our bigger vision for the company is how do we utilize more and more of that 34% that we're landfilling? Because if you think about the bigger, broader vision would be disrupting the current soil economy, which is basically peat that is mined and shipped from Canada, and instead using real waste in every metro market to create a hyper-local vision where you can take that waste cellulose material, potentially food stuff, yard waste, things that people are turning into recycled compost materials, and you can make that into a really great local soil without needing to haul material all over the country or all over the world in the case of cocoa coir. So, if you think about that hyper local vision, we've done a ton of R&D to start to include all these other cellulose fiber sources. And I'll tell you, 10 years from now, we are going to cut that much further into that 34% that we're still landfilling. So, our vision would be to prevent most of that from ever needing to be landfilled.
Yeah, that's great. And just a wonderful transition from kind of the original idea into participating more in the circular economy and limiting the amount of waste produced and being able to, add value in that circular economy where there before was only an expense. So Mont, how do we get the idea from in your head onto Shark Tank?
The first step was actually I went to somebody like who I am right now to help other people commercialize their inventions. I went to the Small Business Development Center and said, hey, I've got this idea, now what? And they directed me to the Small Business Innovation Research Program. It's a annual program that distributes $3.6 billion to small businesses every year. through 11 federal agencies. And when I first heard that, I thought that's got to be a joke. There's no way they give away that much money, but they actually do. And the Small Business Innovation Research Program is probably, I'd have to say that's probably the main reason PittMoss is alive today. I actually did the research that Dr. Bethke spoke of. We also did side-by-side trials at greenhouses at Purdue. I remember one day walking into the greenhouses when all the plants were in full-blown exuberance. And one of the doctors there was like, "Man, you're going to be so rich." I'm 25 years later. I'm still waiting for it, Brian. But no, that's when I had the idea that I did not do this research. I didn't do anything with it. I didn't do anything to impact the outcome. It's what I've learned now is the scientific process. And I think that's really key with anything when you're starting a new business with a new product, a new material. You've got to give it to somebody else and let them experiment with it. And so when I saw that other researchers were kind of impressed with it, I thought, okay, I've got something here. It was just a matter of taking that to a commercial, a viable point. So I knew I needed to like build a manufacturing plant that would be viable on scale. And so that's really what took me the next, I don't know, 10, 15 years to do, is to build a full scale production facility. And most people don't do this. Most people don't cash out their 401ks and sell their house to get the equity out of it. But that's what I ended up doing because I believed it would, if I did it, it would prove the fact that this product would work. So luckily there was a local greenhouse in the Pittsburgh area that gave me the land and the space and the equipment to build this. I purchased a few key pieces of equipment. I think we still use those, if I'm not mistaken, in the plant right now. And it took us about 3 months to build the original proof of concept plant. And I remember it was like mid-August of 2014, I believe, 2013. I figured, okay, I've got 3 switches to turn on. And if we turn it on and it works, great. This has all been fantastic. But if I turn them all on and I mean, it doesn't work, I'm out of money. So I'm screwed. Sorry, I should have sworn. But that's really what it came down to. And from that moment on, I mean, I think investor types in Pittsburgh saw that I had, committed to this. They like to throw around the terms like, they like to see you have your own scratch in the game or your own skin in the game. And so, and I think when they saw that, I thought, yeah, people were starting to come to the table to talk about investing. Brian was with Blue Tree Allied Angels. They were one of the first groups to come. Innovation Works, which is kind of like our Elevate Nexus here in Indiana. They came to the table, and basically from a random story in the National Association of Veteran-Owned Businesses, I got a call from Shark Tank. The Small Business SBA in Pittsburgh had read an article from the National Association of Veteran-Owned Businesses about PittMoss, and they called me and said, "Hey, we'd like to nominate you for Shark Tank." And I was like, "Sure, okay." Never thought anything would happen from it, and we got the call. So that kind of changed the trajectory of the company in a major way.
Phenomenal. And we talk with when we're interviewing artists or other whiskey distillers and other commercial ag interests about overnight success, right? And it never is an overnight success. And it's almost a cliche that we hear entrepreneurs starting a business and leveraging their assets and taking out their retirement and whatnot. And, almost sets the precedent that there is no plan B, right? So, did you have a plan B after investing so heavily? And what
you're
if
going to think I'm BSing, but I actually had this thought in my head that if I did this and I spent all my retirement money and I spent all the equity in my house, I'd probably be living in a studio apartment eating canned cat food for a while. you know, to get back to where I was at, I said, I'm willing to take that bet, you know? So, I mean, you have to like really consider the consequences of what you're doing. You know,
But you
and
still roll the dice and you bet on yourself, and that's the recurring theme, right? Is you have a belief in you and your concept, and you roll
Joe,
the
you know what
dice.
surprises me is like when you have a 50-50 chance, like if you're betting on something, it surprises me how often it comes up what you needed to come up. It really surprises me. So I guess, you know, I figured it would happen. I just figured it would happen. Now, Brian, who is a seasoned investor, probably like, yeah, I wouldn't recommend that. But
Well, that's why you spread yourself thin and you play the odds on the 50-50, right?
It's true. No, I mean, you know, the one thing that I'll say is like Mont's right. Like I've been an entrepreneur. This is my seventh either startup or turnaround that I've been at. I've had one publicly that I was one of the early people in that went public and exited. You know, as an entrepreneur, you have to have that faith. You got to take the risk yourself. You got to put skin in the game, because it always is going to take you longer and more money than you thought it was gonna. Like every time it's gonna. So if you don't have that sort of gumption to go make it work and to take that risk, like it's really easy to give up. And you know, I'll tell you, I hear this all the time that people advise you to pay yourself first. And I've never believed in that. Like I've always believed in take care of everybody else first, take care of yourself last. And that paints yourself into the corner where you cannot fail, right? So I've always thought that was bad advice for entrepreneurs. I always say pay yourself last. That's how you know you're going to make it, right?
Absolutely.
And Mont made all of that early investment to get it to the point where enough investors would believe in what he was doing. And even since then, it has taken much more investment money to develop a whole product line and launch it and support the factory. And it's way, way more money and time and effort than people tend to think it will take.
And maybe, Brian, if it's timely for you to go into that piece of it where you built distribution, once the product was manufactured, you have to build distribution networks, you have to build commercial partnerships, you have to build ag partnerships. Maybe you can touch on that.
Yeah, so I mean, at the point that I had come on in PittMoss, we had what we call our grower grade product, which would be basically the base material. It really is a genius product, and I can't say enough how much foresight Mont had to be able to fiberize that paper and reconstitute it in a way that it wouldn't turn into a mush in a paper mache. And that's really the first step of the magic of what we've got. I think we have all learned over the last years how many other benefits there are to using that material in that manufacturing process that we didn't know about, that I didn't know about 5 years ago. I'm sure Mont didn't know about that 20 years ago. So there are a whole host of other benefits that we have learned about. But it was really, in the time that I have been on board, it had been taking a product and really from that developing a line of products, finding product market fit, finding customers, pricing it properly, manufacturing it, building our formulations in a way that it's cost effective to be able to sell it, and then really building a team to help take it to market. And in this case, because we're in agriculture and sales cycles are not fast, we're not building a widget that somebody can take out of a box and use it right now. We are building a product that relies on people to use it properly, to test it over a long period of time, many iterations, until they're comfortable with it, and then they begin to use it. And the thing that we have found is it's taken a ton of trial and error. It's taken a ton of different recipes to get it right. It's taken a bunch of customers with some failures in there, and trying to really make sure that we've got a good product market fit And even at that, I have been with the company, it'll be 5 years in a month. And it has taken us 3 or 4 years just developing all of the products and the product market fit. And just to give you an idea, you talk about an overnight success. This company has grown at like a 30 to 40% growth rate for 4 or 5 years. In the first quarter of this year, we grew at 127%. So I think we all believe that there's a lot of time in that startup in terms of really developing everything properly. But once you have all your ducks lined up, you can have an overnight success. And we're finding now a lot of recognition in the market. We're finding that people that bought from us a year ago are buying a lot more. They're telling friends about it. I was just in Chicago driving back. I made 3 sales of people that somehow got my cell phone number and called me and placed an order while I was driving. 4 years ago, that we didn't have a dream of that happening. So it really, I do think there is such a thing as an overnight success. I do believe that in the entrepreneurial world, you can develop a product or service that gets in the tornado and takes off, but it's typically not day one. It's typically not year one. It's like building a critical mass to line everything up to allow that to happen. And frankly, hopefully that's exactly where we are as a company right now.
Well, congratulations to all of you. That's phenomenal growth year over year, and especially in the first quarter of this year. I hope that continues. Do you find that growth coming from any particular industry? Is it commercial ag? Is it the bedding? Is it small garden shop and retail?
Yep.
Where do you find it, most of that growth?
I mean, we're really growing in all channels. Our commercial horticulture growers have been growing what they're buying from us. We're adding more wholesalers, more lawn and garden centers. So our existing ones are buying more, and we're adding new ones. Our retail sales online are growing. I would say that our biggest potential right now, frankly, is in cannabis. And I'll give you an example. We have been working with one cannabis grower in particular for 18 months, where they have done, I would say, 4 or 5 trials with us. Our trial data with them was that we demonstrated a 12% increase in yield and a 4.9% increase in THC. Both are massive, massive numbers for the cannabis industry. But it took us 1.5 years to get there with that particular grower. And that grower that spent $5,000 with us over 18 months has now spent $50,000 with us in the last 3 months. So for us, and think about a cannabis grower, they've got a really valuable cash crop. The last thing they're going to do is say, hey, here's a new fertilizer or a new soil. Like, I'm going to go put my entire $1 million crop into this new whatever it is. They're very, very cautious about what they do. But if you're harvesting $1 million crop and you get a 12% increase on that, and now it's $1,120,000 on that crop, and by the way, you can sell it for more because it's got a higher THC content, then this relatively small investment in soil can make a huge difference. And the other thing that we learned about that through iterations with this one cannabis grower is that the fertilizer market for cannabis is so overblown and overpriced, it's not even funny. And we have been working right now on companion fertilizers where, when matched with our soil, we think we can get the yield increase, the THC increase, and we think we can help people to cut their fertilizer cost by 80 to 90%. So think about that. As a grower, you might spend $100,000 on soil a year and $500,000 a year on fertilizer. Those are real numbers for what people are spending, right? So what happens if we can get you to spend $110,000 on soil and $50,000 on fertilizer, and how huge of a difference does that make to your operation? Plus, we're helping you drive top line growth. So, but the point is, like 5 years ago, we did not have a product or the know-how or the customer to work with to get there. But because that has been an expanding market, people are open to trying new things. Even with us working with them for a year and a half, that's how long it took to get that one customer. And we now have 4 referrals off that one customer. So I really believe that, we are going to grow in all of our channels, but cannabis is the thing where we truly, truly have a game changer for that industry.
That's phenomenal. And I love to hear the specifics around the details of what's actually the impact of utilizing a product on a grand scale. And, maybe now we transition into Dr. Bethke and some soil science questions in terms of, having that type of growth would, preclude someone from, transitioning their whole field from traditional soil or PittMoss into PittMoss. What's the, long-term viability of the product? Like year over year, you have to add things to soil, or you have to plant companion crops or alternate crops to reintroduce nitrogen. How does something like a cellulose product like PittMoss compare against a traditional soil?
Well, in this, what we call we're the third paradigm in growing. Third paradigm. The first paradigm was when growers used field soil, garden soil, and other things to create a good potting soil to grow transplants and so on. They would grab various additives, use corn stalks blended with field soil, etc. Then the sphagnum peat business started to develop. At first, the Irish just used the peat for burning and heat, and then they discovered that they could modify it considerably and then create potting soils. And of course, that modification involves changing the pH with adding lime, adding a ton of fertilizer. Sphagnum peat is just terrible at holding nutrients. So they learned to get and develop the soluble nutrients, the fertilizers that we apply through water and liquid application. So they're pouring through the peat moss. And another researcher that I work with says all the peat moss does is tries to hold it in there long enough for the roots to grab it. Whereas now with the cellulose-based and the recycled-based material, which is the third paradigm, we're developing materials that actually sequester or hold the nutrients, somewhat similar to what happens in a good dark garden soil. That comes from the humus and the cellulose that's decayed over time. Now, in a sense, we're accelerating that preparation of the cellulose by grinding the paper sufficiently, reformulating the particles sufficiently. And then when we reformulate those particles, they have to be the right size, the right diameter. So then we thread up these little, I want to call them puff balls. We call them PEDs in agriculture, these little balls of soil that stick together. And in that, we have more air and more water holding than you do in soil or in peat moss, because the fibers are arranged just right. You don't have too many big fibers or too many little fibers that plug all the holes, and the fibers are knitted in such a way. So the management then becomes a little different. We don't have to dump all that fertilizer through this system. We don't have to water as frequently because the water pours through or runs off. It actually is absorbed into the system. So from a sustainability standpoint, it's a phenomenally large step in moving forward in agriculture, and especially in pot and container growing, home gardening, in that you use less fertilizer and less water, but produce better crops. But it doesn't happen easily. We have to re-engineer the product, the cellulose, to make it work this way.
I did see some side-by-side with Brian from, I think, 150 milliliter water pour into some peat moss and then PittMoss, and the way that it maintained and withheld and absorbed the water. That's just fascinating. And Dr. Bethke, you referenced what that'll do for decrease in consumption of growing operations. as well as the decreased fertilization. I assume both of those things have a significant environmental impact, and I'll leave it open to you guys to determine who answers that question and go into some of the specifics about how transformative that could be for global pollution and global water consumption decrease.
Yes, it is huge. As a matter of fact, we're working with some people in California where the soils have been, mono agriculture has been the theme there, and they use chemicals and fertilizers. They've destroyed the biology in the native soils, and so they try to replace the biology with chemistry and chemicals, and there's a lot of runoff, a lot of difficulty in all of that. Where we are reducing greatly that runoff, sequestering the nutrients within the soil, and in stimulating the biology to work well with the plant. And so the microbes, the bacteria and fungi that are in the soil, they want to work in association with the roots of the plant, and they need feed, they need the carbon that comes from the cellulose. Now, the depleted soils in much of the world don't have enough, there's just not enough carbon there. And we have a real interest in some people from Lebanon to improve the soil over there using their waste cellulose and other things. So it's a new paradigm. It's a new step in the circular economy and the circular use of resources. And my concern is good stewardship of the materials that we have.
And one of the things that I would add, one of the things that we are seeing in the marketplace, every once in a while you hear hot button topics or terms that become important later as people better understand them. Lately, it has been all about regenerative agriculture. And if you think about it, what we have been used to doing is fertilizing our plants with chemical fertilizers, going back to the 1970s to try to increase yield. And like Dr. Bethke said, like the peat frame of mind fits that. Like you're hitting this material that doesn't hold or retain water or nutrients very well, and we're hitting it with chemical fertilizers. We're basically force feeding plants. And frankly, like in cannabis, people do that too. We call it the flood flush cycle. You flood it with all these chemical fertilizers, then you have to flush it out to wash it off because it's not that good for the plants and they'll die if you leave it on there, right? When you think about regenerative agriculture, it's really about feeding your soil first and letting the soil feed your plants. And that's because we've got such a carbon-rich material that holds water and nutrients so well. It would be like, the best example would be, think of a thin layer of grass in really poor soil. And, when you get into drought conditions, that is the stuff that turns brown and dies. The roots aren't that deep. It doesn't retain water well. Water will flow off the top of that material. Now, on the other hand, if you've got really rich soil and grass with extensive roots to it, and when you water it, it retains all of that moisture for much longer. If there's a drought condition, there's so much more moisture left in that thick soil that has been built up and in those plant roots. And it's really the paradigm of what we're doing. So where we're finding a lot of traction right now are with regenerative soil people that understand we can be a growing media to help spur and add that microbial growth that you need to grow your soil. So we're really a fantastic delivery system for agriculture, and we can help increase the carbon and microbial growth really in any field anywhere. It's a little newer. It's a hotter topic the last few years, but certainly there are groups out there like Rodale Institute that have been all about regenerative agriculture and organics for years. But it's really starting to become a hotter topic today because people are realizing their yields are increasing tremendously when they improve their soil and moving away from the chemical fertilizers that kill microbial growth. So it really makes a huge difference, and people are better understanding that today than we probably ever have.
That's great. Yeah. And that actually answers one of the questions I had later is the importance of biology and introducing a cellulose product. How do you incorporate biology into that? And what it sounds like is as the roots go down and the water absorption, it actually draws the biology into the PitMoss substrate. Is that correct?
I would say it's more than that. I'll let Dr. Bethke go here, but he just did a really good white paper for us comparing biochar to PitMoss. And Dr. Bethke, I'd love you to talk a little bit more about that and how we're similar and different.
Sure. For microbial activity and high microbial activity, there are several things you need. You've got to have good aeration because the microbes have to breathe. You have to have a good water supply that keeps their, they need it. And then carbon, you have to have carbon there. They use the carbon as the food source. And usually if you have that carbon readily available in a soluble or what we call labile form, it's going to be available. But some carbon can be in a non-available form. It becomes sequestered in the soil forever. One of the things that happens when biochar is produced is about at least 1/4 to 1/2 of the carbon that's in a cellulosic material is recrystallized into a non-labile persistent form of carbon. So it's very resistant to decomposition. And so when you have biochar or other charred materials, you have some carbon that's readily available immediately, maybe for the first year or so. And then the remainder will persist in the soil and it will be sequestered there in the soil, but really not available to the microbes. There's also surface area. Microbes have to grow on a surface of some material. With the PitMoss, we have probably, it's a little hard to say, but between 10 and 100 times the amount of surface area there is in biochar, because biochar has very many different formulations and manufacturing. But all of that surface area then provides residences for the microbes, particularly bacteria, and they will not do well if they don't have the space or the place to grow. They'll bump each other up. And then also you need the good drainage and oxygen, because the non-beneficial, the harmful microbes, pathogenic plant materials, things that give you root rot and other diseases, they will prosper when there's not enough oxygen in the substrate. And with the particles distributed like they are in the PitMoss, we have a good increase in the oxygen infiltration into the substrate. Therefore, we have a good growth of the microbes, and then the moisture is adjacent to that as absorbed into the PitMoss. So it's just like a phenomenal environment for microbial development. It doesn't take much added to a garden soil or a field soil to really stimulate that activity.
We talk to people all the time that are in horticulture and agriculture. I talked to a guy from Cornell a little bit earlier today. They're like one of the top ag schools in the country. And I just can't stress enough how different the paradigm is that Dr. Bethke outlined, that we went from field soil to this peat-based economy to now this like recycled cellulose material. And I just can't stress enough how much more natural it is growing that way, how much better it is for the circular economy to have a local ecosystem where you're basically converting trash and waste into good positive soil. And yes, we need to grow in it differently than peat-based soil, but it's only because we've been conditioned to use this not great product for generations now. Now we're getting back to the way that plants should be grown, and we actually have to adjust for ourselves how we get used to growing that way. So sometimes the best gardeners, the ones that are used to watering and fertilizing the most, are the ones that have the hardest trouble adjusting to a product that doesn't need as much water and fertilizer. So it really is interesting to think about it in terms of soil paradigms and how we went from field soil to this peat-based product to now transitioning to something frankly much more natural, much better for your plants, much better for the planet. And I just, I hope that doesn't get lost from any of your listeners or people that we talk to, because it really is a transformative opportunity for the world right now.
Yeah, and I can imagine that the paradigm shift in the commercial ag industry that is, squeezed every bit of production out of every acre, and the circular watering systems, and it's going to throw a wrench in that. I mean, a positive wrench, but change it dynamically and offer a huge market opportunity for you guys.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're here with Dr. Charles Bethke, soil scientist at PitMoss. We've talked extensively about the advantages of PitMoss. How does PitMoss stack up to home compost? Your eggshells, your veggie cuttings, your leaves and grass.
All right. Well, it's vastly different. When you receive PitMoss, it's a prepared material. It's already been processed to the point which you would like in a really fine quality finished compost. The problem with home compost is the variability that exists in raw materials that you put into it, the conditions in which it's done, the time in when it's finished, the time in which you're using it. So when you say the word compost, you should say composts with an S. There is no two composts that are alike. And usually, even from the finest composter, they're not uniform perfectly from each season and each batch. So we have a uniformity. That's the first thing. Second thing is that compost has a lot of organics that are highly broken down. They don't have the structure that gives you the good aeration and porosity in some situations. It just depends on the material that you've built it from. But you want a good combination of fiber, and the carbon sources have to be such that they won't break down too rapidly. So with PitMoss, the carbon sources have been processed in such a way that they're available, the carbon's available over a good period of time. So you can get probably twice or three times the benefit from PitMoss than you would from the excellent compost that many people make.
How does the biology in PitMoss differ from the biology in garden soil?
Okay, start out with biology in garden soil is going to vary depending upon the garden soil, the conditions, what's their pH, and the parent materials will influence the family of microbes that live there. And then the microbes that live that are really beneficial are the ones that live in association with the roots in the rhizosphere right there in the soil. When we produce PitMoss, we have a lot of carbon there. And so if you were to add PitMoss to a garden soil, it provides the carbon that the beneficial microbes can really thrive in. It also provides good moisture and many sites. The surface area on PitMoss is very, very great. So you have carbon, water, and surface area that allow for a really high population of microbes to exist. And then as the roots develop, those microbes live in association with the roots, and they are available to give support to the roots, supply nutrients, transfer nutrients, and solubilize nutrients to assist the plant.
Understanding that PitMoss is a great substrate to start and grow in. Many of our customers may not have access to PitMoss or may not have exposure to it. Is there a way that they can revive soil if it's dry or compact and they're seeing decreases in the volume that they're producing in their garden?
The biggest problem people have in reviving soil is knowing what's wrong with the soil they have. So the first step to do is to get a good soil test to understand and define whether your soil is alkaline or acidic, whether you have too much of something or too little of something. I had a neighbor just ask me the other day, what's wrong with my garden? I can never grow anything in it. And he brought in a sample and we tested it. The pH was so high, it was in the 8s. And no matter how much nutrients you add or what kind of compost you put in, until you correct that, you will have a poor result. So I always use a hierarchy. First, you have to have good physical structure, good tilth, aeration, drainage, etc. Second, you've got to have a chemistry that's balanced for the nutrients. And there it takes sometimes a little study, but it's easy these days. And then thirdly, you've got to have the biology there. And the biology is there if you have good physical properties and balanced chemistry, and the carbon exists. So if you have a moderate compost or other carbon source, leaves that are clean, grass clippings that don't have herbicides and weed spray in them, or even just some of your own household waste, that all gives you carbon in the soil. But then again, it's takes some time, but you can blend it in and it will work well. Or if you have a compost system, you can blend that in.
You talk about pH levels. How does PitMoss stack up against soil? Alkaline, base, or acidic?
Yeah, PittMoss is near neutral pH, slightly acidic, in the range that we like. We like to have a pH that is usually from 5.8 to near 7, 6.8 or 7. And the reason for that proper pH is if it's really acidic, you get too many micronutrients to be too soluble, and they become toxic to the plant. As an example, you could have manganese toxicity or zinc toxicity from soils that are fairly high in that mineral if the pH is low. And if the pH is really high, phosphorus gets tied up in particular, and even some of the micronutrients as well get tied up. So you want to try to pay attention to that, and usually a good gardener will know where to get a good soil test to have that done, or test their own. It's fairly easy these days.
If you could share the benefit of either a home soil test kit or something purchased from a nursery, or maybe even having it sent off, if there's any benefit over one versus any of the others.
Yeah, I would say this. Soil testing equipment where you stick a probe in the soil and measure the pH, those usually are not accurate. They're too dependent on the moisture at the time of testing or the minerals that are present that are soluble. So a dry soil test like that is not so effective. You can get online and at the stores soil test paper, and then with that you can make a solution. And I always like a solution of 2 parts water and 1 part soil, and stir it up, and that will give you an accurate measure. If you dip the paper into that little water solution, it'll give you an accurate measure and those are pretty good within a half a unit or so. And if you want to be a little more precise, which I often recommend, you can send a sample off. Most universities, state colleges and so on have soil test labs that will do it very economically for garden soil tests. Or you can go online and just Google soil tests or whatever, or just type it in and you'll get suggested labs. And the important thing there is that you get a representative sample of your garden that represents the average condition there. Usually a grab sample of 2 or 3 locations will be sufficient, but if you have a really odd garden with a lot of areas that are different, you might want to take and segment the garden into separate areas and take samples from different areas. But that pH, if you don't have a good pH, and in the West, they have high pHs. In the Southeast, we have low pHs. And so it's good to know that.
Very good. Thank you. And another question that just kind of came to me. So we're going to be dealing obviously with gardeners, flower gardeners, native landscape, some homestead farms. If your soil is producing, is there benefit to knowing the pH, or is it more for problem resolution or solving issues of underperformance?
It will produce best if it's in the optimal range, which is usually that 5.8 to 6.8-ish range. It will produce better. And secondly, the microbial populations will thrive in that range. If it gets too high, you'll only have bacterial populations, and too low, you'll tend only to have more of the fungal populations. And so you want it in a balanced range. So, and if you don't know the pH, there's a lot of people who say, okay, well, put lime on, that always helps. Well, lime will raise the pH. If you put too much lime on, then you've got a real difficult time in lowering the pH, and that's much more difficult, requires sulfur. All of those things are just mistakes, and usually it's better not to do something until you get a number. And if your garden is producing well, there is also the condition that if you have a really good organic material, a good source of carbon, or you blend in PitMoss or other sources of carbon, you can get away with pHs that are a little off scale, because the pH right around the roots is self-correcting through microbial activity.
There seems to be a strong position on a number of different gardening topics online. Do you have a preference, or is there a clear winner in terms of drip irrigation or a sprinkler system?
I like drip irrigation from a standpoint that the moisture on the leaves and the moisture within the plant doesn't create an environment for fungal and plant leaf diseases and plant growth diseases as much. If you always use sprinkler irrigation in the morning so that it dries before sunset, then that's good. If you do it in the evening, that's about the worst thing you can do from a disease management standpoint. Drip irrigation, on the other hand, you always end up with good dry leaves, and you don't have the problem. However, in some situations, sprinkler irrigation will help to cool the foliage, and it depends on where your garden is and what your condition is.
We talked about monocultures, and we often reference monocultures as the lawn that we all try and maintain and keep dandelion free, and how unnatural that is. We're just starting to explore the idea of companion planting for pest reduction and nutrient benefits. Do you recommend companion planting in a garden situation?
Yes, it's usually not as successful as most people would like. It does do some help. One of the things that happens with a good lush garden area and a lot of companion area situations where you have a lot of natural environment, natural insect predators develop. And if you avoid pesticides, which is a common practice when you do companion planting, you plant materials that you feel will help to control the insects. And if you then avoid the pesticides, you don't kill the predators that kill the bugs that you want to get rid of. So I think the secondary effect of companion planting is as important as the primary effect, in that by companion planting, you can avoid using as many insecticides, and that way you'll have better predator activity.
Last question that we'll close with is, again, to fertilize or not to fertilize?
Well, let me tell you this. You always want to plant your plant with the green side up. And if you have good nutrition in the bottom side, the soil, your plants are going to do well. Now, I am not against chemical fertilization. Then if you fertilize with chemicals very judiciously and sparingly just to hit what's missing, then it will help. However, natural fertilization through manures and compost that are rich, that then gives you some buffer against over applying some materials. For example, if you were to over apply a fertilizer that had a lot of ammonium in it, then that ammonium will cling to some of the organic matter and result in some toxicity. And so you have to wait until that ammonium is converted to nitrate. And then if it's too wet, that's a problem. Or if you put too much potassium, which is in most fertilizers, that becomes a problem. So to fertilize is how do you apply the right fertilizer you need? Poultry manure is really high in calcium and nitrogen. Cattle manure is high in potassium. There's different things that you actually are fertilizing when you put all those natural materials on. So you're going to have to supplement the soil with some source of nutrients if you harvest a lot of material off of it, or if you have a lot of water leaching it out. So you do have to have some supplements there. If you build a biology that's really strong and put in, some people say water only, water only soil. If you put in all of these things, like if you put in alfalfa, you've actually fertilized with some nitrogen in that case because it's in the alfalfa. So that's kind of a trick question, but it's you just have to recognize there's different ways to deliver the nutrients.
Certainly, and thank you. And it was not my intention to raise a trick question. I understand the variability that goes into all of these. Just trying to get in the mind of our potential viewer and see what we can solve for them from an issue. But this was.
I just have one more thing I wanted to say, and that is that you can always tell these people that they should learn and be open to trying new things, learning new things, and doing it. And as we say in horticulture, when you're green, you grow, and when you're ripe, you rot.
Fantastic. I appreciate that, Dr. Bethke and Brian Scott. Thank you for your time. Really enjoyed having a discussion with you guys and learning the backstory of PittMoss and gaining some insight into our soil health.
Great. Thanks for having us on, Joe.